They made him serve coffee to the very men who had stolen his ideas, in front of a room packed with executives and partners, without a second thought. As if humiliating a black man who had given them their future was just another part of the meeting agenda. No one stopped it, no one questioned it, they just laughed and looked away, pretending not to see the quiet erasure happening right there, under the polished lights and glass walls. To them, he was never meant to be anything more than background noise. A reminder of how the system always finds a way to put people back in their place. What they didn't know was that the man they thought they could erase had been planning their downfall for years. And every smug glance, every stolen idea, every silent betrayal only made the final blow sharper. This is the story of how a man buried by the system rose to own it piece by piece. If this story is, we'd love for you to stay with us. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd especially love to know which part of the journey resonates with you the most, and where you're watching from. Your voice matters here, and we're building something bigger than just a story together. The morning sunlight slanted sharply through the towering windows of Orion Logistics headquarters, casting long beams across the polished floors. Ezekiel Morgan adjusted the cuffs of his simple, well-worn dress shirt and made his way past the gleaming conference rooms toward the staff training area. He had always taken pride in his work, even when recognition came sparingly. Today, however, felt different, a hollow kind of day he had learned to recognize. As he entered the training room, he spotted a young man slouched casually in one of the seats. Garrett Coleman, fresh from some Ivy League MBA program, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too tight and an attitude too large for the room. "You must be Mr. Morgan," Garrett said, barely hiding the disinterest in his voice. "I hear you're the one who's supposed to show me the—" "Yes, condensing. We'll start with the fundamentals of our supply chain systems," he said, voice even. Garrett shrugged and pulled out his phone, thumbs tapping mindlessly. For the next 3 hours, Ezekiel painstakingly walked Garrett through the intricate logistics algorithms, warehouse flowcharts, and vendor contracts that formed the lifeblood of Orion's $700 million zero-cent supply empire. Every question Garrett asked was met with a patient answer, every mistake gently corrected. By noon, Ezekiel had typed up a detailed guide specifically tailored for Garrett, something no one had ever done for him when he first started. As they finished, Garrett clapped Ezekiel on the back a little too hard. "Thanks, man, but honestly, most of this stuff's pretty basic, right?" he said with a cocky grin. Ezekiel only smiled faintly, swallowing the pride he had every right to feel. He had seen this pattern before: teach the new blood everything, then watch them sail past him into promotions that were never offered his way. Later that day, an email popped into Ezekiel's inbox. Team announcement: Garrett Coleman promoted to Junior Supply Chain Manager effective immediately. A hollow laugh escaped Ezekiel's lips before he could stop it. Garrett, with barely a day's worth of training, was now his superior. His phone buzzed again. A meeting invite: strategic planning session, 3 p.m., conference room A. Ezekiel closed his eyes for a moment, then rose from his chair, his back straightening not from pride but defiance. In the vast, glass-walled conference room A, executives were already gathering when Ezekiel arrived. Coffee pots gurgled in the background. Pastries lined a silver tray. He found a seat near the back, where he had learned long ago he belonged. As the discussions kicked off market expansions, operational costs, vendor renegotiations, Ezekiel jotted notes silently, though he knew he would never be asked for input. Suddenly, midway through Garrett's half-baked suggestion about making shipping sexier, whatever that meant, Laura Kim's voice cut through the room. "Ezekiel," she said, smiling too sweetly, "would you mind refreshing the coffee for the group?" The room fell silent for a beat. Ezekiel blinked, momentarily stunned. Around him, the other executives smirked behind their coffee cups. A few exchanged looks, like kids watching a playground bully taunt the quietest boy in class. "Of course," Ezekiel said finally, rising with a quiet dignity that cost him more strength than any warehouse shift ever had. As he gathered empty cups, balancing them awkwardly on a flimsy plastic tray, he caught Garrett winking at one of the others, a cruel, complicit joke at Ezekiel's expense. His ears burned, but his expression remained blank. In the pantry, as the coffee machine hissed and whirred, Ezekiel gripped the counter's edge until his knuckles whitened. Not because of the task itself, he wasn't above hard work, but because of what it symbolized: a calculated a clear reminder of where they thought he belonged. Returning to the conference room, he refilled cups with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact. No one thanked him. No one even paused their conversations. It was as if he were invisible, a ghost moving through the machinery of ambition. Garrett laughed loudly at one of his own jokes. Laura tapped impatiently at her tablet, already shifting the meeting's focus. Ezekiel placed the last cup down and retreated quietly to his corner, heart pounding not from embarrassment, but from a different, colder fire. The fire of clarity. They thought they had broken him. They thought they had rendered him harmless, a silent fixture to be ignored or ordered about. What they didn't realize was that humiliation wasn't defeat. It was fuel. When the meeting finally adjourned, Ezekiel lingered, pretending to organize his notes. In reality, he was observing the alliances, the hierarchy they thought so impenetrable. Good, he thought. Let them underestimate me. As he left the room, the Orion Logistics slogan once again caught his eye, etched boldly above the exit. Innovation, inclusion, integrity. He allowed himself a bitter smile. They had given him every weapon he needed to tear them down: arrogance, blindness, and the one thing they never expected him to have: patience. The week after the humiliating coffee incident, Ezekiel Morgan sat in his cramped cubicle late into the night, bathed in the cold glow of his computer screen, piecing together what he believed could be the lifeline Orion Logistics desperately needed. A global shipping bottleneck loomed large, threatening to paralyze supply chains across North America, and while executives continued to posture in meetings and throw around buzzwords, Ezekiel knew the company was woefully unprepared. He spent days cross-referencing vendor contracts, analyzing transportation data, even waking at odd hours to phone his old industry contacts to understand real-time port congestion patterns. What emerged was a comprehensive contingency plan, a full-spectrum solution that could save Orion tens of millions, keep their reputation intact, and even poise them to gain market share while competitors floundered. Titled Project Phoenix, the plan was detailed, innovative, and grounded in hard data. It was, in short, everything Orion's leadership claimed to be searching for. When the internal email announcing the Orion Innovation Challenge popped up a company-wide competition for cost-saving ideas during the crisis, Ezekiel felt the smallest flicker of hope ignite. Maybe, just maybe, merit would finally speak louder than politics. He submitted Project Phoenix the same day, triple-checking every figure, polishing every word until it gleamed. As the days ticked by, he allowed himself cautious optimism, even imagining his name being called during the all-hands meeting scheduled for Friday, where the winner would be announced. Maybe this time, he would finally be seen. When Friday arrived, the auditorium buzzed with energy. Posters boasting "Ignite Your Innovation" lined the walls, and a DJ blasted energetic pop songs that only served to highlight the corporate desperation. Employees filed into their seats, laughing, chatting, oblivious to the knot tightening in Ezekiel's gut. On stage, CEO Trevor Langley adjusted his cufflinks and flashed his perfect smile. Today, Trevor boomed into the microphone, we celebrate the future of Orion, a future built by fresh ideas, bold action, and most importantly, fresh faces. The words stung before Ezekiel even fully registered why. As Trevor continued, he listed off 3 finalists, all under 30, all plucked from the latest round of management trainees, all white. Ezekiel sat frozen as the crowd erupted into applause. His hands, which had spent endless nights crafting Project Phoenix, now lay limp in his lap. His name wasn't called. His work wasn't even mentioned. After the ceremony, he sought out Laura Kim, who had been on the judging panel. Approaching her at the reception area where champagne flowed freely, he cleared his throat. "Laura, excuse me," he said. She turned, sipping from a flute of sparkling wine, eyebrows raised in polite impatience. "I was wondering if you had a chance to review my submission for the Innovation Challenge. Project Phoenix?" She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to recall something buried under a pile of irrelevance. "Oh yes, Ezekiel," she said, her voice syrupy and patronizing. "Look, it's not that your proposal wasn't solid, but the leadership team felt it didn't quite align with the youthful Brandon Mintus." Ezekiel blinked, stunned. "But it addressed our logistical crisis directly. It could have, Laura waved a manicured hand dismissively. It's about energy, Ezekiel. Fresh perspective. You know how it is. She offered a tight, insincere smile before turning back to a group of rising stars clustered around the shrimp cocktail platter. Ezekiel stood there for a long moment, absorbing the message unspoken. No matter how perfect his work, he would never be the image Orion wanted to project. It was not about solutions, it was about optics. Word travels fast in offices built on whispers, and within days, Ezekiel noticed the shift. Conversations would hush when he entered the break room. People who once nodded politely now looked through him, as if he were just another piece of undue. One afternoon, while refilling his water bottle in the cafeteria, he overheard two junior associates murmuring near the vending machines. "You know he's just a diversity hire, right?" one whispered, glancing around. "Management keeps him around for the numbers." The other chuckled softly. "Makes the annual report look good. Inclusion, representation, all that PR crap." Ezekiel stood still, his back turned, pretending to read the nutrition facts on a granola bar. He knew better than to react. Still, something in his chest crumpled. The seeds of doubt they planted were insidious, poisoning his relationships subtly but thoroughly. People who once sought his mentorship now avoided lingering too long at his desk, afraid, perhaps, that proximity to him might tarnish their upward trajectory. Even Garrett, in his new managerial post, made sly comments during team meetings, tossing around phrases like fresh blood and real leadership potential, with pointed looks Ezekiel couldn't pretend to misinterpret. The erosion wasn't dramatic, it was slow, like water eating away at stone. Until one day, you looked down and realized your foundation had vanished. Sitting alone in the cafeteria one evening, watching the cleaning crews vacuum around him, Ezekiel turned his badge over and over between his fingers. Was this really what he had sacrificed his peace of mind for? Was he foolish to believe merit would ever shield him? His phone buzzed a LinkedIn notification. Orion had posted a celebratory article. "Meet our future leaders, young minds, big dreams." Scrolling through the glossy photos of the Innovation Challenge winners, he saw their fresh faces beaming, posing with their oversized checks, bathed in corporate approval. He closed the app slowly, setting the phone down as if it weighed 100 pounds. For a moment, Ezekiel allowed himself to feel the full weight of the betrayal, not just by the company, but by the idea he had built his entire career around, that excellence would be enough. Outside the cafeteria's glass walls, the city glittered indifferently. Ezekiel stared out into the endless maze of lights and steel and ambition, realizing with bone-deep certainty that no one was coming to rescue him. No one was going to hand him anything. If he wanted a future, he would have to carve it out with hands already bloodied from years of silent battles. He exhaled slowly, pushing back the bitterness curling inside him. Not yet, he told himself. They think they've won. They think I've accepted my place. Good, let them think that. Rising from his chair, he tucked his badge back into his pocket and walked out of the cafeteria, his mind already racing ahead, strategizing. A storm, no inevitable storm building inside him, a storm no Enable and Avant challenge could ever hope to contain. And just as he rounded the corner toward the elevators, he nearly collided with Ezekiel. Barely had time to steady himself after the crushing realization at the Innovation Challenge before the next betrayal found him, disguised as a smile, hidden in a handshake, masked under the sickly sweet veneer of friendship. Because rounding the corner after that hollow night in the cafeteria, he ran straight into Daniel Whitaker, a mid-level project manager known for his easy charm and even easier ambition. "Hey Zeke," Daniel greeted, his tone overly familiar, clapping Ezekiel on the shoulder with an affable grin. "Heard about the innovation thing? Total garbage, man. You deserved that win." Ezekiel, caught off guard by the sudden show of support, nodded cautiously, saying little, instincts sharpened by experience whispering that unsolicited kindness in O'Brien was usually the prelude to a favor. "Listen," Daniel continued, lowering his voice I got wind that the execs are panicking about the bottleneck projections. They're scrambling for a solid contingency plan, like yesterday. Ezekiel's heart flickered, a dangerous, fragile hope. "Didn't you say you were working on something?" Daniel pressed, his eyes gleaming with something too eager to be pure camaraderie. "Maybe I can pitch it with you, back you up. Get your ideas to the right people." The offer dangled between them, baited and gleaming, and despite every warning screaming in Ezekiel's gut, Despite every slight he'd endured, some small, battered part of him wanted to believe, wanted to trust, that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen his worth. "All right," Ezekiel said finally, quietly. "I'll send you a draft." That night he stayed late again, fine-tuning Project Phoenix even further, stripping out corporate jargon, polishing the numbers until they shone like diamonds under a spotlight. He sent the updated file to Daniel's private work email at 2:17 a.m., a brief message attached. "Please keep this confidential." Final proposal attached. No reply came that night, nor the next day. But when Ezekiel arrived at work Monday morning, the halls buzzed with barely contained excitement. Word spread like wildfire. Daniel Whitaker had stunned the executive team with a brilliant, airtight crisis plan, saving Orion Logistics from impending catastrophe. A hero born overnight. Ezekiel sat at his desk, reading the leaked internal memo with numbed disbelief. Every line from Project Phoenix, every projected ROI figure had been lifted wholesale. The only difference was the name on the header. Daniel Whitaker, Strategic Response Plan. His breath caught painfully in throat, and before he could even begin to process the theft, his phone rang, the screen flashing a summons he could not afford to ignore. Victor Reynolds, Sr., and possessing the kind of ruthless polish that turned boardrooms into battlegrounds, he epitomized everything wrong and unstoppable about Orion's leadership. When Ezekiel entered Victor's glass-walled office, he was met not with fury or disappointment, but something infinitely more dangerous: polite disdain. "Morgan," Victor said smoothly, barely glancing up from a sheaf of papers. "Have a seat." Ezekiel obeyed, his body rigid. "We have a problem," Victor continued, tapping a neatly manicured finger on a printed report. "There's been a massive logistics error in our Pacific routes, inventory misallocated, client contracts breached, financial exposure. North of $50 million, he paused, letting the number land like a hammer. Victor said, his voice low and deliberate. "Your name happens to be attached to the authorization codes on several key dispatch orders." Ezekiel's stomach twisted. "Sir," he said carefully, "I haven't signed any new dispatch orders for Pacific routes in weeks. I would have flagged a perception out for the 50K. Intentional or not, perception is reality, Morgan," he said with a thin smile. "And the perception right now is that you were negligent." Ezekiel felt the floor tilt beneath him. "This is a misunderstanding," he managed. "I can pull the logs, the timestamps. There must..." "There's no need," Victor interrupted smoothly, steepling his fingers. "Upper management has decided to handle this internally, for the good of the company's image." He leaned back, surveying Ezekiel like a chess piece he was about to remove from the board. "We'll mark this as a procedural oversight under your supervision. You'll accept a formal reprimand and we'll move you to a non-critical role while we clean up the..." Ezekiel's fists clenched beneath the table, nails digging into his palms. He understood the game now, understood it with brutal, perfect clarity. They needed a scapegoat, someone expendable enough to absorb the fallout without rippling the pristine surface of Orion's brand. And a mid-tier black analyst with no visible allies was the perfect sacrifice. "If you refuse," Victor added almost lazily, "we'll have no choice but to absorb the fey note." The implication hung heavy in the air. Lawsuits, blacklisting, professional exile. Ezekiel swallowed hard, tasting iron, his mind spinning through calculations faster than any algorithm he had ever designed. There was no winning this hand, not today. But survival was still on the table. He forced himself to nod once, curtly. "Understood." Victor smiled, cold and victorious, dismissing him with a flick of his eyes back to the papers on his desk. Outside the glass office, the Orion hive buzzed on, oblivious, uncaring. As Ezekiel walked numbly back to his cubicle, a few coworkers glanced up briefly. Their own wanted to be seen aligning with a sinking ship. He sat down, staring at his blank monitor, his world narrowing to a single furious point of focus. They had stolen from him, humiliated him, sabotaged him, and now they were throwing him to the wolves. But they had made one critical mistake which thought the game was over. They thought he was defeated. And as he pulled up a new private document on his personal drive, a plan already forming in the back of his mind, he knew he would make them regret underestimating him. Every last one of them. Because while they celebrated Daniel's brilliance and blamed Ezekiel for financial disasters he hadn't caused, deep within the labyrinth of Orion's logistics empire, buried under terabytes of ignored data, Ezekiel knew something they didn't. Something that could. The day after the fabricated logistics scandal pinned itself to his name, Ezekiel found an email waiting in his inbox with the soft menace only corporate language could wield so effortlessly. Subject: informal, catch up with human resources. Today, 3:00 p.m. Room 12C. No explanation, no context. Just a bland calendar invite that might as well have been written in blood. Ezekiel stared at it for a long moment before accepting, his heart sending a cryptic. He knew the script by now. The so-called informal meetings were anything but casual. They were carefully orchestrated performances where the noose was placed gently, even politely, around your neck at precisely 3:00. He stepped into room 12C, a sterile glass box outfitted with 2 low faux leather chairs and a single table. The air conditioning hummed too loudly, chilling the small space with manufactured indifference. Across from him sat Monica Preston, opening a bottle of masterpieces, and her smile a price blend of concern and corporate detachment. "Ezekiel," she said warmly, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice." He nodded once, his body coiled tight beneath his business casual armor. Monica folded her hands neatly on the table, her manicured nails tapping an absent rhythm against the wood. "I just wanted to have a conversation," she began, drawing out the word like taffy. "About your future here at O." Ezekiel kept his expression neutral, knowing better than to show any reaction before he understood the full shape of the blade she intended to sink between. "It's been a challenging few weeks," Monica continued sympathetically, her voice low and confidential, "and leadership has some concerns about your fit moving forward." Ezekiel inhaled slowly through his nose. "I see," he said evenly. Monica's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Now, to be clear, we're not forcing anything," she said, leaning forward slightly as if offering a secret. "But sometimes, in situations like this, it's healthier for both the employee and the company if transitions are voluntary." She let the sentence dangle delicately between them, as if the word resignation were too vulgar to say aloud. Ezekiel tilted his head slightly, feigning thoughtfulness. And if I choose not to transition?" he asked, his voice calm, almost curious. Monica's eyes flickered just once before settling back into practiced empathy. "Well, naturally, we would have to follow formal disciplinary protocols," she said smoothly. "And unfortunately, that could complicate future employment opportunities elsewhere." The threat was served on a silver platter, draped in the velvet of good intentions. "You've contributed a lot to Orion," she added, as if the eulogy had already been written. "It would be a shame for your departure to be contentious." Ezekiel offered a small, polite smile in return, one that did not reach his eyes. "I'll think about it," he said, standing before she could prolong the charade any further. Monica rose as well, extending a hand that Ezekiel shook briefly, feeling the absurdity of the grimace burn in his palm, as if civility could sanitize betrayal. As he exited the glass box of room 12C, Ezekiel felt 100 unseen eyes tracking him, weighing him, waiting for the final act of the performance where he would bow out gracefully, obedient to the quiet machinations of the machine. He didn't head straight back to his desk. Instead, he veered toward the atrium, needing air, needing space, needing anything that wasn't suffocating under Orion's manufactured empathy. He found himself near the outdoor terrace, a small luxury granted to employees like a treat to well-behaved dogs, and it was there, leaning against the railing overlooking the city's endless sprawl, that Garrett Coleman found him full of swagger and carefully practiced humility. "Hey, Zeke," Garrett said, pushing his sunglasses up onto his head, his tone casual, almost friendly. Ezekiel turned slowly, offering a nod but nothing more. Garrett stuffed his hands into the pockets of his slim-cut chinos, shifting awkwardly. "Look, man," he began, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "I just wanted to say, don't take all this." Ezekiel arched an eyebrow, silent. Garrett rushed to fill the space. "I mean, you had a good run, right? 10, 11 years? That's nothing to sneeze at," he laughed weakly. Ezekiel remained silent, letting him twist. "It's just," Garrett continued, lowering his voice, "this world, it's built for certain kinds of people, you know? Fresh faces, new blood, people who fit the brand." He hesitated, then added, in a tone meant to sound helpful but instead sliced cleanly through Ezekiel's composure. "Sometimes it's better not to aim too high, man. Saves you the heartache. Ezekiel stared at him for a long moment, seeing him fully now, not as a rival, not even as an enemy, but as something smaller, something pitiable, a puppet who thought himself a player. Garrett patted him awkwardly on the shoulder, a condescending gesture dressed up as kindness. "You'll land on your feet," he said. "Just maybe think smaller next time." And with that final insult disguised as advice, Garrett walked back inside, his figure swallowed by the glass and steel hive that had decided Ezekiel was expendable. Ezekiel stayed by the railing a moment longer, gripping the cool metal until it bit into his skin. He watched the city pulse beneath him, a living map of opportunity and betrayal and survival. And somewhere deep within that endless maze, he knew there was a way to turn all of this against them. All he needed was the right moment, the right leverage, and when it came, he would not aim small, he would not settle, he would not accept their ceilings disguised as kindness. He would. The coldness Garrett left lingering in the air didn't dissipate as Ezekiel returned to his desk. If anything, it thickened. An invisible fog that followed him through the hallways, into meetings, into elevators where conversations would cease the moment he stepped in. People no longer looked at him directly, or if they did, it was with that same faintly embarrassed sympathy one might offer a man marked for execution. Days blurred together under the sterile hue of fluorescent lights, the polite indifference of colleagues becoming heavier with each passing hour. And then, one morning, the first true warning arrived, tucked neatly into his inbox between routine, supply chain updates and corporate newsletters. The subject line was blank, the sender untraceable. When he clicked it open, the message was short, chilling in its simplicity. "Stop making noise, or your family learns what consequences mean." Ezekiel sat frozen, heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less monstrous, if he only blinked enough times. His mind raced, replaying every recent conversation, every late-night session on secure drives, every whisper of rebellion he hadn't even dared to voice aloud yet. Someone knew. Someone was watching. The implications cascaded through him, his sister in Baltimore, his mother in Charleston, the people he had kept out of his professional life precisely to protect them, now dragged into a game they didn't even know existed. He closed the message and deleted it without hesitation, forwarding nothing, saving nothing, trusting no one. The thread wasn't about what he had done, it was about what they feared he might do. And in that fear, he found the confirmation he needed. He was closer to something dangerous, something they couldn't afford to let breathe. Later that same day, as if to underscore how little he was valued, Ezekiel was informed that attendance at Orion's semi-annual Partnership Appreciation Gala was mandatory, a black tie event hosted to dazzle stakeholders, foreign investors, and high-value clients. The invitation alone should have been flattering, but Ezekiel knew better. His presence wasn't a reward. It was another stage on which he would be paraded, or perhaps humiliated. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the St. James Hotel, chandeliers dripping crystal, covered in white linen and flickering candles. Chandeliers buzzed with polite artifice. Ezekiel wore his one good suit, tailored years ago for an award ceremony he hadn't been allowed to attend because more visible employees needed the spotlight. He moved through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns like a ghost, invisible except when necessary. It was during the second hour, as the crowd grew more lubricated by vintage Dom Perignon, that it happened. Victor Reynolds, polished and predatory, stood near the front of the stage with several senior executives and key partners from the APAC division. Ezekiel hovered near a table, sipping ginger ale, when Victor's voice rose above the murmur of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, waving a glass in mock salute, "let me introduce you to the man who taught us all the true meaning of corporate loyalty." Laughter rippled through the immediate circle. Thin in anticipation, Ezekiel stiffened, unsure whether to move closer or disappear. "This," Victor said grandly, placing a firm hand on Ezekiel's shoulder, "is Ezekiel Morgan, the very embodiment of..." Victor continued, his tone light but his eyes cold. "In a world full of stars, sometimes you need a dependable benchwarmer." More laughter, less masked now. Ezekiel's face burned, but he forced himself to stand still, forced himself to smile that brittle, dead smile corporate survivors knew so well. "Never quite made the big plays, our Ezekiel," Victor said, pausing dramatically. "But hey, not everyone's cut out for the spotlight." Nearby clients from Mitsubishi and Gen X Solutions exchanged amused glances, whispering behind cocktail napkins. Some from the German delegation chuckled audibly. Ezekiel's fists curled at his sides, hidden by the drape of his jacket, rage boiling so hot he tasted metal. But he did nothing, said nothing, because Victor wasn't just humiliating him, he was baiting him, pushing for a public scene that would give Orion grounds to eject him permanently without recourse. Ezekiel locked eyes with Victor for a single searing second, seeing in them not just cruelty but fear. Fear masked by arrogance, because bullies only mocked what they feared might someday surpass them. When Victor finally let him go, Ezekiel melted back into the crowd, head high, heart splintered but not broken. The gala spun on without him, a glittering carousel of empty laughter and false smiles. Ezekiel found the nearest exit and slipped away into the cool night, standing alone beneath the towering facade of the hotel, breathing in the exhaust and neon and human despair of the city. He pulled his phone from his pocket, thumb hovering over the contact list. There were people he could call, connections built carefully over years, people who didn't yet know they would soon have a choice to make between loyalty to a rotting empire and survival alongside something new, something inevitable but not. Yet, not tonight. Tonight he needed to think, to sharpen the blade they thought had dulled. Across the street, a group of young executives stumbled out of a bar, laughing, their voices loud and oblivious. One of them bumped into Ezekiel without even noticing, muttering a half-hearted apology as he rejoined his pack. Ezekiel watched them go, watched the city pulse with blind, arrogant life, and he knew the time was coming when the ground would shift beneath their feet. And when it did. The week after the gala humiliation passed in a haze of whispered conversations and avoided gazes. By the time Ezekiel was summoned back to human resources, the outcome was already written. Monica Preston's voice was all syrup and steel as she handed him the notice, citing organizational restructuring and temporary reassignment to the Orion Consolidated Distribution Center, located 50 miles outside the city limits, in a dusty industrial wasteland where promising careers went to wither and die. "This isn't a punishment," Monica assured him, her tone so gentle it might have been mocking if it weren't so detached. "We value your contributions, Ezekiel, but sometimes a change of environment helps everyone recalibrate." Ezekiel said nothing, simply accepted the thin manila envelope containing his transfer details. When he returned to his desk, a few coworkers pretended not to see him packing his belongings into a battered cardboard box. Others offered the barest nods of acknowledgement. No one helped, no one intervened. Even Garrett kept his distance, perhaps afraid that proximity to a sinking ship might somehow drag him under too. The next morning, Ezekiel boarded a rusted company ship, the Orion logo peeling from its sides, and rode in silence through endless stretches of cracked asphalt and abandoned warehouses until they reached the sprawling gray fortress that was the Consolidated Distribution Center. The security guard barely glanced at his ID before waving through. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp tang of motor oil, sweat, and resignation. Forklifts beeped as they maneuvered through towering aisles of inventory, and overhead fluorescent lights flickered like dying stars. His new office was a metal desk tucked behind a stack of discarded shelving units. No computer, no chair, until he found one abandoned by the trash compactor. The first week blurred into a grim cycle of manual inventory checks, pallet audits, and data entries into outdated terminals that crashed more often than they saved. It didn't take long for Ezekiel to understand the unspoken rules of this place. Keep your head down, don't ask questions, survive, not out of malice, but because they had learned that attention here was dangerous. The forgotten employees of the distribution center moved like shadows, hands calloused from endless labor, faces hollowed by years of being invisible. One night, while reconciling shipping manifests for a batch of international containers, Ezekiel noticed something strange. One set of cargo supposedly bound for a humanitarian relief effort in South America had discrepancies. The weight logs didn't match the invoice totals. The vendor listed was a shell company Ezekiel had never heard of despite a decade of experience in Orion's vendor network. Curious, he dug deeper, using an old login credential from his previous role that, miraculously, hadn't yet been deactivated. Cross-referencing shipment IDs led him into a labyrinth of data inconsistencies. Containers listed as carrying medical supplies were insured at rates 10 times higher than their supposed value. Destination addresses traced back to abandoned ports in countries known more for laundering illicit goods than receiving aid. Heart pounding, Ezekiel compiled the data carefully, pulling receipts, satellite logs, and internal authorizations signed off not by warehouse supervisors, but by upper executives' names he recognized all too well. Victor Reynolds. The distribution center wasn't just a graveyard for careers. It was the nerve center of an elaborate smuggling and money laundering operation disguised under the banner of supply chain complexity. Ezekiel leaned back in his rickety chair, the full weight of the discovery crashing down on him. It wasn't just about humiliating him. It wasn't even about silencing a dissenter. It was about protecting a corruption scheme that could topple Orion from the inside out if exposed. He realized, with a grim sense of clarity, that his transfer had been less about exile and more about containment. Bury him where the bodies were hidden. They had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed he would still be afraid, but staring at the pile of digital evidence growing on his encrypted flash drive, Ezekiel felt something else blooming inside him, something colder, sharper, more deliberate than anger. He understood now that the only way to survive was to stop playing by their rules entirely, to dismantle the machine from the inside out. But to do that, he needed leverage, he needed allies, he needed time. The same patience he had been forced to perfect through years of silent endurance would now become his greatest weapon. Outside the warehouse, the sun dipped behind a wall of container stacks, bathing the entire yard in blood-red light. Ezekiel slipped the flash drive into the inner lining of his jacket, heart steady, mind racing ahead, calculating risks and moves and counter-moves. Somewhere deep within the corporate citadel, the clock had already begun ticking, and they didn't even know it yet. A storm was coming, not the kind that could be weathered by PR statements or scapegoats, but one born from every betrayal, every humiliation, every whispered threat. And it would. Ezekiel didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at the battered metal desk in the warehouse office, the glow of his laptop the only light in the cavernous dark. Outside, the forklifts had long since fallen silent, the air thick with the scent of diesel and concrete, while inside, Ezekiel methodically organized the treasure trove of evidence he had stumbled upon. Each folder, each digital signature, each phantom transaction meticulously cataloged and encrypted onto multiple drives. He worked with a precision born not merely from desperation but from design, because despite everything they thought they knew about him, Ezekiel Morgan had never truly been one of them, not from the beginning. 3 years ago, after realizing that hard work and loyalty alone would never breach Orion's glass ceiling, he had made a different kind of choice, quietly allying himself with Blackstone Equities, one of the most aggressive private investment firms in the world, known for buying, gutting, and rebuilding industries from the inside out. On the surface, Blackstone was just another Wall Street juggernaut, but beneath that veneer, it harbored a hunger for disruption, for chaos strategically applied. Ezekiel had been recruited not as a saboteur, but as a scout, a silent observer embedded deep within corporate ecosystems to identify weak points, vulnerabilities, the soft underbellies of bloated empires ripe for acquisition or destruction, or even had been a target from the start, bloated, arrogant, corrupt beneath its polished brand, and in addition, who had once dreamed of rising within it, now served as the instrument of its reckoning. Every humiliation he suffered, every indignity he endured, had been another stone in the foundation of a greater plan. They had unwittingly taught him how to break them. And now, with the smoking gun of financial malfeasance clutched in his hands, the moment had arrived. He encrypted the files 3 separate ways, uploaded redundant copies to secure Blackstone servers, and drafted an internal memo titled simply, "Orion Compromise, Immediate Action, Recommended." Then he pulled out a phone. Not his personal one, but the second device he kept hidden in a hollowed-out dictionary beneath his bed, dialing a secure line that connected directly to Blackstone's Special Acquisitions Division. The call was answered on the second ring. "Status?" a clipped professional voice demanded. Ezekiel's own voice was calm, emotionless, the voice of a man who had long since bled out his anger and replaced it with purpose. "Phase 1 complete," he said. "Operational vulnerabilities identified, full documentation secured." There was a brief pause. Then, a new voice, deeper, more commanding, came onto the line. "Proceed to Phase 2, the voice said. "Pressure application authorized. Prepare assets for expedited control transfer." Ezekiel ended the call without another word, placing the burner phone back into its hiding place. He closed the laptop slowly, savoring the finality of it. The storm he had spent years building was no longer a distant threat. It was now a living, breathing inevitability. Still, precision was key. Brute force would not topple Orion. Leverage would. The kind of leverage that left no clean exits, only surrender or ruin. 2 days later, under the pretense of returning inventory log, Ezekiel arranged an unannounced visit to Orion's corporate headquarters. The front desk receptionist barely glanced at him before buzzing him through. No longer a threat, barely even an employee in their minds. Exactly as he needed it. He moved through the marble halls with silent purpose, ascending to the executive floor, where Victor Reynolds, Laura Kim, Trevor Langley, and the other titans of Orion plotted their next theft of the future. He left identical envelopes outside each of their office doors, each package slim, professional, containing a single USB drive and a printed cover letter. The letter's language was formal, almost courteous, a masterpiece of corporate diplomacy masking an unmistakable threat. You are hereby notified of the existence of material evidence indicating fraudulent activity, including but not limited to financial misrepresentation, money laundering, and regulatory violation unless specific corrective actions are initiated within 72 hours. Said materials will be released to the SEC, IRS, DOJ, and multiple media outlets simultaneously. No signature, no return address, no bluff. He returned to the warehouse before anyone noticed he was gone, knowing that by the time those envelopes were opened, a clock would start ticking that no amount of PR spin could unwind. The next morning, chaos bloomed like wildfire through the corridors of Orion's leadership. Emergency meetings convened behind closed doors, legal counsel flown in from out of state, phones ringing off the hook, and still no one knew where the attack had come from. Victor Reynolds, in particular, grew increasingly paranoid, demanding full audits of security systems, cross-referencing employee records, searching for a saboteur among the ranks. But they wouldn't find him, because they weren't looking for a man who had spent years playing the fool. They were looking for an enemy loud and reckless, not for someone like Ezekiel, who had weaponized silence itself into his sharpest blade. Meanwhile, through encrypted back channels, Blackstone's acquisition team began quietly reaching out to Orion's more vulnerable stakeholders, offering lifeboats to those willing to abandon ship before the wreckage became public. Leveraged piled upon leverage, a slow, merciless strangulation. Ezekiel watched it unfold from the shadows, knowing the next move would determine not just the fate of Orion, but his own ascension. Because while the first phase had been about survival, the phase now unfolding was about conquest, about taking everything they had denied him and reshaping it into something they could never touch again. The difference between revenge and revolution lay not in rage, but in strategy, not when he had the pieces in his hands to build an entirely new empire atop the ruins of the old one. All he had to do now was tighten the screws one final turn, and when he did, the panic among Orion's executives grew more fevered with each passing hour. Ezekiel monitored the internal tremors from a distance, unseen yet omnipresent, like a ghost pulling strings they couldn't even name. 3 days after the anonymous evidence packages had detonated across the upper floors of the skyscraper, the first crack appeared. Trevor Langley, usually the embodiment of smug invincibility, quietly canceled a major media appearance citing 2 more days, and Laura Kim's assistant was spotted shredding entire file boxes late at night. And by the end of the week, an emergency board meeting was called, under the guise of strategic realignment. But it wasn't enough. The leverage Ezekiel had unleashed wasn't designed to trigger a simple scandal. It was meant to incite total structural collapse. Through encrypted intermediaries, Blackstone Equities offered a lifeline, a controlled demolition rather than an uncontrollable explosion. The terms were simple. Orion's senior leadership would transfer operational control of the entire supply chain and logistics division, the core revenue artery of the company, to a Blackstone-backed consortium in exchange for non-prosecution guarantees and retention of their personal wealth. But at a price so low it bordered on humiliation. Ezekiel watched from the warehouse office as the documents arrived via secure courier, contracts meticulously prepared by Blackstone's legal hounds, offering pennies on the dollar for assets that once commanded market-dominating premiums. Desperation stripped the executives of whatever pride they still clung to, facing regulatory destruction, criminal investigations, and public disgrace. They capitulated one by one. Victor Reynolds fought the hardest, of course, storming out of board meetings, threatening lawsuits, leveraging old favors. But none of it mattered. Blackstone had orchestrated the collapse with mathematical inevitability, and Ezekiel was the blade at their throats. The final signatures came through at 2:47 p.m. on a gray Thursday afternoon. No champagne toasts, no victory speeches, just the silent, grim reality of transfer documents filed and finalized within 24 hours. Ownership of Orion's entire logistics empire shifted from aging insiders to a Blackstone-controlled entity called Phoenix Logistics Holdings. a name Ezekiel himself had suggested months earlier, almost as a joke. After the sale closed, the true maneuver began. Investors who had once laughed at Blackstone's quiet accumulation of shares now found themselves minority holders in a machine they no longer controlled. Within a week, under the pretense of organizational streaming, Blackstone dissolved Orion's original board of directors entirely, leaving behind only a skeletal interim management team handpicked to ensure compliance, but even that was temporary. Because on a cloudless morning 6 months after Ezekiel's exile to the distribution center, Phoenix Logistics Holdings called a global press conference at the newly rebranded Orion Tower. Media from 4 continents gathered, lured by rumors of unprecedented corporate upheaval and the unveiling of a radical new leadership model. The lobby was transformed into a gleaming PR battlefield. Banners proclaiming Harlem's Harlem. Journalists buzzed, flashes from a dozen cameras turning the atrium into a strobe-lit hive of anticipation. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the new chairman of Phoenix Holdings stepped onto the podium, flanked by executives from Tokyo, London, and Sao Paulo. He cleared his throat, scanning the crowd, then with crisp authority declared, "It is my honor to announce the appointment of Mr. Ezekiel Morgan as Chief Executive Officer of Global Logistics Operations." A ripple ran through the room. Journalists leaned forward, pens scratching feverishly, because even in an industry rife with disruption, this was seismic. Ezekiel Morgan, once a forgotten analyst buried under a mountain of corporate apathy, now stood poised to helm a $700 million, 0 cents global logistics titan. When Ezekiel walked onto the stage moments later, the applause was immediate but tinged with shock. He was no longer the man they remembered. Gone was the modest suit and hesitant smile. In its place stood a leader radiating quiet, lethal confidence. He shook hands with the chairman, posed for photographs, answered questions with the poise of a man who had already won before the first flashbulb popped, but beneath the polished surface his mind never stopped preparing for the inevitable. Counterattacks. Because power was not an end, it was a beginning, and the enemies he had unseated would not remain defeated forever. After the press conference, in the privacy of his new top-floor office overlooking the skyline, Ezekiel allowed himself one moment of reflection, standing by the window as the city churned below him, the same city that once ignored him, underestimated him, betrayed him. Now it would answer to him. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him, a text from Blackstone's regional director. "Congratulations. Phase 3 greenlit. Full autonomy approved. Execute at discretion." Ezekiel stared at the message for a moment, the enormity of it settling into his bones. He had climbed from the dust of the distribution center, not just to reclaim a seat at the table, but to build a new table entirely, one where he would decide who sat and who starved. Yet even as the weight of victory pressed against him, a colder thought lurked in the recesses of his mind. Victory bred visibility, visibility bred danger, and danger, if left unchecked, bred downfall. As he turned away from the window, a new plan already taking shape. He knew that if he wanted to keep what he had built, if he wanted to reshape this empire into something truly unstoppable, there was still one final reckoning ahead. Because while Victor Reynolds and the others had been removed from power, they had not yet. Barely a month after Ezekiel's public coronation, the first subpoenas began to land on the polished mahogany desks that once symbolized untouchable power within Orion. It started quietly at first, a rumor here, a whispered warning there, but it didn't stay quiet for long. By the end of the first quarter, the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and several state prosecutors had launched parallel investigations into financial irregularities uncovered during the Blackstone acquisition audit. At the epicenter of the maelstrom stood Victor Reynolds, once proud architect of Orion's internal power web, now exposed as the chief conspirator behind a multi-million-dollar laundering operation that spanned continents and spanned years. Ezekiel watched with cold detachment as news outlets gleefully devoured the fall of a titan, Victor's name plastered across headlines, his face frozen in every unflattering photograph they could find. The man who once humiliated Ezekiel in front of international partners now shuffled into courthouses in cheap suits, flanked by grim-faced attorneys. Court documents revealed staggering charges: wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to commit money laundering, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors sought the maximum sentence, 15 years without parole, citing Victor's orchestration of systemic abuse that jeopardized not only shareholders but international trade networks. Worse still, Every asset Victor had once hoarded so arrogantly, his Orion stock, offshore accounts, Manhattan penthouses, was frozen under federal asset forfeiture. Within weeks, he went from billionaire to penniless pariah, abandoned even by the friends and allies he had once protected with backroom deals and bloodless smiles. Meanwhile, Ezekiel's hand moved silently behind the scenes, ensuring that every tendril of Victor's old network was cut, sterilized, and burned. The restructuring of Orion, now fully absorbed into Phoenix Logistics Holdings, was swift and merciless. The so-called loyal lieutenants who once laughed at Ezekiel's expense, who had conspired to bury him under mountains of bureaucracy and casual cruelty, found themselves summoned to cold conference rooms where severance packages were slid across tables without ceremony for the few deemed too expensive to terminate outright. Ezekiel orchestrated a different fate. Departmental reassignments that stripped titles, Saturn, and are reduced to menial middle management roles with no real authority. People who once presided over global operations now managed local distribution routes, fighting daily fires over missing pallets and late invoices. He watched without pity as Laura Kim, once the strategic mastermind who dismissed his ideas as misaligned with the brand, was reassigned as a compliance officer, a glorified hall monitor, buried under spreadsheets she couldn't manipulate. Garrett Coleman, the bright-eyed opportunist who stole Ezekiel's plans and patted his shoulder with empty sympathy, found himself transferred to a cold storage facility in the Midwest, managing freezer inventories in sub-zero temperatures for a fraction of his former salary. Even those who tried to distance themselves from Victor's cabal couldn't fully escape the reckoning, because Ezekiel understood better than anyone that silence in the face of corruption was complicity. The message was clear and brutal. There would be no return to the old ways. Phoenix Logistics was being rebuilt not just in structure but in spirit. And loyalty would no longer be bought with favoritism or fear, but earned through merit and integrity. The media, always hungry for narrative arcs of meteoric rises and catastrophic falls, couldn't get enough of the unfolding drama. Headlines chronicled the dismantling of Orion's old guard. Almost daily, feature articles lionized Ezekiel as a listened transformation in an industry long stained by systemic bias and unchecked arrogance. But Ezekiel himself knew better than to believe the hype. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a hero. He was simply a man who had survived long enough to reshape the battlefield in his own image. And survival, he knew, was never guaranteed. The purges and prosecutions were only the beginning. The real challenge, the real war, would be sustaining what he had built without becoming the very monster he had toppled. Yet for now, as he looked across the new organizational chart finalized that morning, seeing fresh, diverse names rising through the ranks based on skill rather than sycophancy, Ezekiel allowed himself the faintest glimmer of satisfaction. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something lasting could be forged. Still, not everyone had gone quietly. Not every enemy had surrendered to inevitability. Dark currents still eddied beneath the gleaming surface of Phoenix's rebirth, and somewhere, in the spaces Ezekiel couldn't yet see, the seeds of future resistance were being sown by those too stubborn or too foolish to accept the new order. He would need to be ready. Always ready. Because while today was a day for restructuring, for redemption, and for righteous consequences, tomorrow might bring. The purges had subsided into a new, uneasy equilibrium by late autumn. The leaves in the city turned burnt gold and crimson, and Phoenix Logistics thrummed with a wary, vibrant energy. New blood filled the halls where once only stale ambition had reigned. But even amidst the cautious optimism, the ghosts of the old order lingered. One afternoon, as Ezekiel finalized plans for the upcoming global expansion strategy, his assistant buzzed through the intercom. "Sir, Emma Saunders is here to see you. Says it's personal." Ezekiel paused, the name tugging at a long-buried memory. Emma, once a mid-level operations manager, had been among those who silently stood by while he was humiliated. One of many who had smiled politely even as she drifted closer to power like a moth to flame. Part of him wanted to refuse the meeting outright, to let the past rot in peace, but something heavier, something harder and more tempered by the lessons of his own journey, urged otherwise. "Send her in," he said. Emma entered hesitantly. Her once impeccable professional facade cracked around the edges. Her blazer hung looser now, her eyes rimmed red. She looked not like the polished corporate climber she once had been, but like someone who had fallen through every safety net she once believed would catch her. "Ezekiel," she began, voice shaking the strap of her worn handbag as if it were a lifeline. "I know I don't deserve to be here, E." He said nothing, merely gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat carefully, as if afraid the very air might reject her. She faltered, taking a deep, ragged breath. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Real tears slid down her cheeks, not the performative ones Ezekiel had seen so many times before in corporate boardrooms, but the raw, unvarnished kind. "I knew," she whispered, voice cracking. "I knew what they were doing to you, and I didn't stand up. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I kept my head down, maybe they'd let me survive." She wiped her face with a trembling hand. "But in the end, they discarded me too, like everyone else." Ezekiel watched her carefully, weighing every word, every tremor, not out of cruelty, but because trust, once broken, demanded more than apologies to rebuild. "I don't expect forgiveness," Emma continued, voice barely above a whisper. "But if there's any place here, anywhere I can help, start over, even at the bottom. I just want a chance." Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Ezekiel leaned back slowly in his chair, staring not at Emma but through her, seeing the countless others like her, caught in systems they didn't build but upheld anyway out of fear or ambition. He thought about his own path, the doors slammed shut in his face, the smiles that hid knives, the moments when survival demanded swallowing his own pride. If he had been given a second chance at the height of his despair, would he have taken it, or would he have clung to bitterness until it devoured him? "Emma," he said finally, voice steady, "I believe in consequences." She flinched, as if struck. "But," he continued, "but I also believe in redemption." She looked up at him then, a flicker of hope igniting behind the exhaustion in her eyes. "Not just for you," he added, "for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, that they'll never be enough, that their worth is conditional." He rose from his seat, moving to the window where the skyline stretched out in endless possibility. "We're launching something new," he said, "the Second Chance Initiative." Emma furrowed her brow slightly, confused. "It's a hiring and mentorship program," Ezekiel explained, "specifically designed for individuals marginalized, overlooked, or pushed aside by traditional systems, whether by race, age, background, or past mistakes." He turned back to her, meeting her gaze squarely. "That includes people who once stood against me, knowingly or not." Emma's breath caught audibly, disbelief and gratitude warring on her face. "It's not charity," he added sharply. "It's opportunity, but it must be earned." She nodded frantically, tears streaming anew. "I'll earn it," she whispered. Ezekiel studied her a moment longer, then extended his hand. She took it, gripping it tightly, not out of entitlement but with a fierce, humble desperation to build. As Emma left his office with the beginnings of a real second chance clutched in her hands, Ezekiel sat down again, exhaling slowly. He understood that real power didn't come from crushing enemies or basking in victory. It came from breaking the cycle of vengeance, from planting seeds where others only sowed salt. The scars of his journey would never fully heal, but maybe, just maybe, they could serve as a map for those who came after. Outside, the sun dipped behind the city's jagged skyline, casting long golden beams across the floor of his office, a symbol not of endings, but of something harder, rarer, infinitely more valuable than revenge: redemption. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment in Ezekiel's journey impacted you the most? And while you're at it, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we'd love to build this community together.